Evening. We're going to be tonight with Jonas. It has been literally months that we've been preparing for this stream. And Jonas and I are tonight going to talk about a topic that is really actually in the air. It seems that with the autumn arriving in Finland and the change of season, a lot of people are starting to have these seasonal depression. There's this internal focus. It's getting quite heavy sometimes at work. So we thought we'd do a stream on talking to yourself in a healthy way. And of course, Jonas, thank you for coming here, Jonas, tonight. As a therapist, as a clinical psychologist, you have a lot to say on this. So before we jump into the topic, why did you pick this topic? Because we brainstormed for about an hour, all the different possible topics. Why was it that you thought this topic was interesting, Jonas?
Because I think when people think about communication, they tend to focus on communication to other people, and they focus on, how clearly they communicate their ideas, how they manage to understand other people. But in practice, they don't spend that much time necessarily studying or focusing on the conversation they have with themselves, with their head. And I think most people that have put in a tiny bit of, legwork when it comes to, personal development or knowledge of themselves, they'll tell you that we tend to be our own worst enemies. In many respects, we get in our own way more than anyone else gets in our way. And in a large part, to a large extent, because of the way we talk to ourselves. So I thought, okay, well, communication, let's talk about the ways we all talk to ourselves in our heads. And no, that doesn't make us crazy. By the way, everyone talks to themselves. Even doing it out loud doesn't make you necessarily crazy. So
worth a try. With headphones on, nobody ever knows if you're talking to yourself or the phone. So
exactly.
Jonas, those of you who don't know us, you might figure it out from our voice and from some of our resemblances. We're brothers, okay? And we've been talking about this topic literally for years. And even though Jonas has been working with Green Elephant, there's also his own work working with sort of therapy in the south of France, doing garden therapy as well. And I think one of the things that makes Jonas tonight particularly interesting to talk to about this topic is that he's constantly getting people asking him for personal coaching as a sort of, okay, once you've gone through the therapy with your patients, like how do you then go to the next, how do you grow into the next stage of your life? And it's something you've been doing a lot of kind of life coaching. And the topic that's been recurring when we've chatted about it has been, okay, well, how do I take this further without a therapist? Or how do I sort of tackle my own internal voices without having to always have an external party like you? So, and you've been giving them all sorts of assignments and tools and looking into things that work. So that's why I thought it'd be nice to have you here to talk about really down to earth, what works, what doesn't, what's dangerous, what's safe, what you've learned that are blind spots and myths that people have. And just to give a bit of context for those of you who've joined this stream for the first time, we're doing this under the umbrella of Green Elephant. So I'm showing you the periodic table of communication, which is we're basically measuring how do people connect with each other and looking at it from an angle of behaviors and mental models at the bottom. And it's a huge field that's untapped. Very few people are actually looking at the broad spectrum of both internal communication and communication between people. The intersect between the two is what's interesting here. It's like your voice is in your head, obviously affect how you talk to other people. If you're shouting to yourself and in conflict with your head, how can you be empathic and kind to people outside, right? So we've been looking and researching this, particularly in the focus area of conflicts and transforming tensions into creative tensions and trust instead of dysfunctional, trust-destroying conflicts. And that's kind of where we are today. Is Jonas works a lot with us on training in conflict boot camps, but essentially we're doing a series on all of these different boxes from the periodic table. And today's focus is one of the elements that is to do with self-reflection. So like, how do you look at yourself in the mirror, and how do you objectively look at yourself without having, mind games with yourself, if you like? And that's how we got to this topic. And there's a lot to be said in history from this. Before we even jump in, people who start looking at this topic, they find the ancient know thyself maxim, and then there's lots of other ways that you can look. I mean, if you look at it historically and you look at a semantic complete overview of history, the biggest footprint of self-reflection is the art of war. The book Art of War, I just got myself an illustrated copy of it. Art of War, which is from the 5th century BC as a book. It's been a manual for people to also know how to look at themselves objectively and know by self-reflection the nature of their thinking in the context of war. Kind of interesting. It's not actually often about war. It's about knowing your own shortcomings and sort of being pragmatic about yourself before you engage in a highly dangerous and hostile situation. I think it's quite relevant today when people like to point their fingers on the outside world, at the war and everything. First, let's start with ourselves and make sure that we're not creating wars in ourselves before we go and point at people outside who are actually in deep, serious conflict. So that's kind of the framing for today, is that the invitation is first to all take responsibility for our inner voices and whatever conflicts come out of that before we start pointing outside and saying these people are right or wrong. And in that spirit, Jonas, let's start with the heaviest of those elements that we had thought about, is psychological safety. As a therapist, obviously, you have a lot to say on that topic, but what would you say is what are the symptoms that talking to yourself is maybe not healthy and that you should seek some professional help?
Yeah. So I think first important point is that it's never a substitute for talking to other people. We remain so creatures. We literally need that to stay sane. And even people that label themselves as introverts, even people that land on the autism spectrum, any condition, any place you land in the mental health classifications, you need people in some way or another. So it's never a substitute for talking to others. But that being said, there are still some important things that can be, counterproductive or dangerous about spending too much time, engaging with yourself and talking to yourself in a certain way. So maybe one of the slightly less obvious ones in the age of, personal development, growth, and, journaling and all of that is that it can be counterproductive if you're really using that as a substitute for action. You're overthinking every single decision, you're journaling every single decision that you have to make, you try and make perfectly, and that can just be something that in itself is counterproductive, and the benefits can outweigh the costs. If we go into a little bit of a darker level of the question, we can start to look at things like generalizing. When you say to yourself, "Oh, I always do this. I always end up making this mistake," or setting yourself up for failure. I know I'm going to, and it's not going to go well. I'm going to screw up this meeting. There's no way that the client is going to find me credible. So projecting yourself negatively into the future goes against principles of sports psychology. If you think about the athletes, the visualizing the game and where they have to focus, they're not imagining themselves, messing up. And there's a reason for that. Another thing to look out for in that self-talk would be reasoning in absolutes, 100% black and white. It was good or it was bad. In this situation, it went well, or, it went terrible. There's no space. How much learning can you derive from that? It's very difficult to qualitatively get anything from something that's just purely terrible or great. It's interesting to look for those, open questions. Like we often say when we're telling people about being green to other people, ask what, how, when, under what circumstances. Don't just ask a yes or no question. Was I a good person? That's a very broad question. How did I come across in that situation? Maybe more of an interesting reflection question. Which leads to another point, which is if you're going to be talking to yourself in the same way as if you're talking to a friend, sometimes it's more important to have the good question than to have good advice or good answers. So certainty isn't always the best thing to aim for, even though it's, more reassuring to have 100% certainty about a question or a decision. But there's something to be said about the power of good questions instead of the power of good answers. Just think about how you just share a problem with them and they just give you all a list of generic advice that they think would work for them, but in practice it's kind and you appreciate it, but it's not really that helpful. But think about times where they've asked you that question that made you go, I hadn't thought about it in that way, and that's one of the main objectives of therapy as well, is to offer that space to take a step back and think differently about these things. A lot of this is something you hear a lot from men actually. I don't need to go to therapy because I want to find my own solutions. Well, good news, because if you find a therapist that's giving you solutions, maybe look for another therapist. That's not necessarily something that's going to empower you. The idea is to become self-sufficient, right? You don't want
Yeah,
just a
yeah.
crutch to lean on in every aspect of your life.
And Jonas, like before we go any further, I'm just going to do a little framing on the process, so that you know how we usually work. When we work internally, we split between the process and the content. And if you've been watching our channel, you've seen the chaotic video. So I like to have the process below, so you understand what we're doing without it being over designed and too structured, because we're bringing a bit of chaos into the conversation by what emerges and shows up in the chat. So, but for us to know what we're doing, we have at least 5 things that are going to be key ways, like practical ways that you can talk to yourself in a healthy way, like strategies or tools or methods of self-talk, basically. And I'm deliberately keeping it wide to keep the suspense so that you watch, but these will be added in as a summary to the video below when we do the replay in YouTube. But basically now I think what we could try is just starting from now that let's establish that it's a good idea to talk to yourself. And you just don't know how. There's probably lots of barriers. Most people feel a bit weird and ashamed. At least when I started talking to myself in the street with my headphones on, I didn't feel too comfortable at first, even though I could literally be talking on the phone to somebody. But it felt weird. But it started to create a different dynamic of self-talk in the street. And that took some getting used to before it became really useful for me to actually as a sort of thinking tool. So Jonas is going to have some concrete tips and tools like that can help us to try these out and see how it helps without it always being the same answer about self-talk, which is, yeah, it's okay to do so, but how? Okay, so maybe what would be the first one in your opinion, Jonas? Where do we start?
I mean, if we think of talking to yourself as a means to an end, and that end being taking care of that relationship you have to yourself, understanding yourself. Again, let's reason with you're wanting to talk to a friend. Why are you talking to that friend? To feed that connection, to maintain the peace. So the first one would be regularity, in a way. That would be the first way to talk to yourself is regularly. If you want to maintain a relationship to a good friend, generally that person is a good friend because you interact with them regularly. They don't have to update you every single time on every aspect of their life. You ask them, oh, how was that job interview? How are things going with the missus? You know, like you have all these, you've got, you're up to speed. So you can do that in different forms, but for those of you that are into journaling, setting a pace, a realistic pace for that journaling, it doesn't have to be every day, or if it's every day, it can be literally a few minutes, but some degree of regularity so that it's still rewarding, but it doesn't feel like a chore. Most of us have very full to-do lists and put a lot of pressure on ourselves. So the idea is not to add guilt into the mix when you're not able to, you know, work out regularly or journal regularly. And by the way, these opportunities to talk to yourself, you don't necessarily have to journal. You don't necessarily have to sit down and think hard. You can also let some of this emerge in the same way that you don't have to force a conversation with a good friend. But typically, you need to be by yourself for that to happen. Even when you're, you know, in the presence of your loved ones, it's rare that you would have such tolerance to silence that you would literally be sitting there for minutes without any form of interaction or without reacting on what's, you know, going on around you. Especially if you have like a family life, how realistic is it to really give you think and update yourself about when you have to run and, you know, feed the kid, collect them from school, from their activities, you've got to do the shopping, you know. So it can also happen in a way that you just give yourself time to walk alone in the forest, and that can be enough. But you need regular time alone as a bare minimum to talk to yourself in a healthy way. Otherwise, you're only talking to yourself in moments where you're stressed in between activities, and then it's stress talk. You know, it's like complaining to yourself, like, I can't believe the traffic today. Really, it really shouldn't be. Oh, I really can't stand my job. Like, this is really pissing me off. And then you're going home,
Like
and you're like, oh,
negative
I'm, you know,
spirals. Yeah,
just ranting. The only conversation you have with yourself is ranting. You know, imagine
yeah,
if you,
yeah. And
yeah,
and
yeah,
that's when usually you want to distract yourself. That's when you go, okay, I can't handle this internal, so I'm going to put my Spotify, my podcast,
yeah.
my whatever it is I'm having to entertain, my Netflix in the background in the bus or whatever. So in a way, self like regular is also about knowing what rhythm you need. Usually, do you have like an idea of what would be a good regularity for it to be healthy? Like, is it daily, weekly, monthly, yearly?
That's going to vastly depend on what you're trying out of this, and um, your kind of motivation to do this. But generally speaking, it's better to do something regularly but in small doses than very intensely spaced far apart. Think about it
Yeah,
as a habit. It's part of your routine. So generally for most people, it's going to be weekly, a certain number of times per week, or at a certain frequency per day, as part of their evening ritual, or getting up ritual. A lot of people have early morning journaling to set objectives for your day, or to
actually, it could be
shift
it could
into a
be
certain,
it could
yeah.
be any time, as you say, that you would do it when it fits your mental space, your time when, as you said earlier, you can be alone. By the way, hi, welcome to Gilo. Maha, I was just curious how often you're journaling or reflecting. It's a conversation we've had in the past about how important it is to have time with yourself to give you your thinking
Mm,
space. I was just curious, Maha, how
mm.
often you're able to actually realistically schedule. It might be interesting because if you're in startups, Maha's rhythm will probably be a good indication of what's possible for you as well. So, one other thing, Jonas, is regularly. Do you have any tips for doing that? Do you like? Do you are you sort of? How do you do it to keep it regular?
It's nice to integrate it in moments where you're already done, to go in the direction of what already exists and flow, so you don't have to create a whole new different routine to fit in this new habit. Lunch
Mm,
breaks are a time where I always keep a bit of reflection time for myself. Flexi time, sometimes I turn that into a cheeky nap, half an hour nap, so that I have, fresh focus for the afternoon.
mm,
But sometimes I'll sit down and do some professional journaling on reflection questions on themes and topics and ideas. Sometimes I'll journal specific points of my, personal life. But I tend to distill it into those little moments, those in between times where it can be frustrating because you feel like something didn't go according to plan,
yeah,
and you end up with hands like time on your hands that you don't necessarily know what to do. Well, in that moment, I often would sit down in a cafe, um, and just pull out my journal and just jot a few things down. It doesn't have to take more than a few minutes, but it's a
mm,
I guess you could see it as a recentering, asking
yeah,
yourself the question, checking in on yourself, like, okay, what do I need right now? Because it's easy to make it about all these other imperatives you have throughout the day, and other people that you have to keep happy, email you answer. So it's those little moments that it's realistically easiest to do it, while you're having breakfast, while you're
yeah.
on your commute. Um, yeah, in those little
So,
snips of
so
freedom.
that's like the check-in. So I kind of jotted down here. You can probably see just about what I'm jotting down. I'm just doing a bit of visual harvesting first, but um, regular check-ins with oneself in one way or another, with some
Yeah.
with a focus on either verbalizing in out loud or on a paper with a pen, but the externalizing it in some way. That's one.
Yeah.
What about a second one? What would you say is a second way of doing self-talk that's healthy?
Just again, before going to the second point, I just want to emphasize, if you have to find a bare minimum, schedule
Mm,
alone time regularly. That's it. That in itself will suffice as an MV, so to speak. But
yeah.
yeah, in terms of a second point, I think the other way would be with compassion. If you're going to talk to yourself, um,
Mm,
be nice, but be compassionate. You can be demanding of yourself. You can be strict, but still be exercise in self-parenting. Be a nice parent, but be a fair parent, but don't be, a parent that lets their child walk all over them. You're not
mm,
doing yourself or the kid a favor in that respect. Um, so that would be like a way to make this tangible. Is most people talk to themselves differently than they talk to other people. If
mm,
they catch themselves messing up, imagine you're driving your car and your best friend is driving, and they don't see like a pedestrian that's about to cross, and they have hit the brakes a little bit hard at the last minute. what is reaction likely to be if, you're not the person driving versus if you're driving? Most people would be
Mhm.
more relaxed and would calm their friend down and be like, "It's all right, it happens, just, watch out here. It's true. You don't really see the patrons well." Or, they would find them an excuse, they would reassure them, and they would, tell them to, keep going. That happened. But if it happened to them, to yourself, you're likely to obsess about it and to think, what does this say about my character? Am I a bad driver? Especially if you're prone to anxiety, like something like that can throw you off and absolutely
Mhm.
ruin your day. So it's important to try and full of that tone already as a first step. Be aware of that underlying attitude that you actually have towards yourself, because that's going to transpire in the tone of voice that you have with yourself.
When I
And if you're,
started reading
yeah,
up Jonas on the thing, like I think isn't it transactional therapy, the parent inner child
transactional analysis, yeah.
transactional analysis. Thank you. So when I started looking this up a few years ago, I started to get really into this, and I started writing in a journal with three voices. So I would have label inner parent, label inner child, label inner adult, and then I started counting in my journal the number of occurrences of I need, I want, I choose, and I should. So the inner parent was every time I said I should, and then the inner child was the one I said I have to, but I don't want. And then the inner adult is the one that says I choose without making excuses, justifications, or moaning to myself. And it was really interesting because I started by noticing that most of my journal was all about parent child. There was no adult. It was just my inner child and my parent having arguments. And then I started to realize, hey, I do have a choice. What if I take the adult role for once and see what happens, and I don't have to mediate between the parent and the child? So I started journaling and consciously choosing to write, choosing instead of I choose, and instead of saying I should, I have to, I'm constrained, I'm the victim of time, I'm too tired, no, I choose to not rest because I'm in a sprint at work. Oh, do I have to choose this? Suddenly the whole train of thinking evolves into a more potentially healthy direction of questioning some of my prioritization. So there we go. That was just like a little anecdote of how self-compassion with the
Yeah.
parent-child. Have you tried this with any of your patients? With the how does that work in therapy?
Oh, yeah, that's a very common framework that I use because it helps to, first of all, break aside part of us acting, out of unison in the whole time. Like this idea that we're always consistent and coherent, and that often throws people off when they catch themselves being inconsistent or, just doing things that are seemingly counterproductive or the opposite of what we want or what they want at certain times. And it is helpful to understand that we do have different parts of us, and different parts of us come to the surface at certain times. And this is not
Mm,
just emotions, it's literally modes of functioning, roles that we've internalized, and identity labels that we, adhere to and stick to ourselves that play out over, generations and generations, and you've got societal dimensions to this. So it's useful to think in terms of parts and to take a bit of distance, take a step back from, the ego, as most people would, say it quite plainly, and realizing that, yeah, you do have different parts. So some people don't like the parent, adult, and child. They prefer to break it down different roles, different archetypes. Some people break it down like characters in a theater play. So mm.
is that why you talk about your cat Loki as and you say that he calls you daddy? Is that a way of doing external? Is talking to animals ethically allowed in terms of talking to oneself? That's an interesting one. Like, how is the ethics of talking to an animal in a way that you're projecting your inner parent child onto the animal? Does that
Yeah.
count as healthy?
It's healthy as long as the cat doesn't answer you.
Can you
No.
give us an example of how that parent-child dialogue might go in somebody's head? Not saying yours, but just in general, just for tangibility.
Oh well, I can absolutely give you my example with my cat because that's a good way you become aware of it is actually with the other people. Um, I find myself noticing and being especially sensitive to when I perceive him suffering. Like if he uses this to manipulate me 100%. He puts on this super melodramatic meowing, like really making it sound like he's starving and ravenous, because through conditioning, he has realized that that is my weak spot. I'm not going to be manipulated through play. He's not going to be able to, bring me the ball, lure me into the kitchen, and then make me feed him. But he can sit there whining at 3 a.m. next to my face, and I will eventually get up and feed him. So that is one way in which you can learn something about your inner parenting style. And I do tend to, at the same time, be annoyed by my child whining, but at the same time, I give the most attention to my inner child when it's in distress. So part of my personal journey is to carve out space and time and energy for that part of me, from a constructive place of, feeding something that is positive instead of always just meeting its needs when, something goes bad or the needs are unmet. But even when the need being met, you can also maybe meet them even a bit more. It's not just because you're eating that you've got to stop. That's it. You don't just have to have a bowl of rice. You can treat yourself to a gastronomic meal once in a while. So that's one concrete way in which my reaction to my cat taught me something about myself. And I was able to turn that into a concrete action point of carving out more quality time for myself in the positives, not just when I don't feel good or I feel stressed, or, feeling awesome might still be a great time to take a day off, within reason, obviously.
And when we measure that, like in terms of the assessments we do online for conscious communication, one of the things we're measuring is called Philautia, so self-compassion. It's the Greek word for self-compassion, and it's kind of interesting to use because it's got this harmonized 8 types of Greek love, which you can look up in our YouTube channel. It's kind of a popular video at the moment for some reason. I think people are needing to connect with each other. But the whole idea of Philautia is what the Greeks called self-compassion, which was obviously the gateway to be able to actually connect and love other people, without which you're constantly needy towards others. And the love is often said to be a projection of our own needs and lacks rather than being really kind of real connection. So Philautia is how, when we talk internally, when I say to Jonas, okay, this week you've done a lot, how are you going to take some Philautia time? That's how we talk about it. So it's become a code word for us as a team. When we use the word Philautia, it kind of means, are you being respectful of your me time? And we will respect it. It's implied that we value it all equally as much as doing productive time. And that's a healthy thing to build in a culture, particularly in a startup, if any of you are listening and CEOs of startups. Yeah. Hint, hint. What about number 3, Jonas?
Number 3 would be related to the time frame in which you're talking to yourself, the tense, so to speak. So generally speaking, like for most things of the mind, it's good to talk about present. Let's imagine a stressful situation. You're realizing money's tight, right? Inflation is hitting you. Your energy bill came in and you are smacking your forehead with your palm, wondering, okay, wow, that feels stressful. And then your anxious thoughts start to spiral naturally, right? Your brain is picking up on a threat, so it's going into, fight or flight mode. In that moment, you're not going to be able to, unless you're the Dalai Lama, you're not going to be able to talk yourself off the ledge immediately, right? You're going to have to accept that you're going to be hit by a wave of emotion and fear, and that's okay. It's part of the game. And once you've managed to weather that first wave and get your head back up and have a little bit more control over your thoughts, one direction to think about is, what can I do about this right now? Because that prevents spiraling into this place and to plan contingencies on contingencies and playing a whole game of chess, when in fact you only have to move one of the pieces on the chessboard. There's only a certain number of games of moves that you can make ahead of time. I'm sure if they're good chess players here, they might be able to tell us exactly what that number is. But I'm sure that mathematically you could get to a moment where it would be absurd to try and calculate that far ahead, because at some point your opponent has to move the part back, right? So trying to make this about the present as much as possible is useful, also to prevent this self-fulfilling prophecy of, when I was 12 years old, I was awkward, and the whole rest of my life I'm going to be awkward. And every time I think about a social situation, I think about how my 12-year-old self would handle it. Well, maybe you're not going to handle it in that way. Maybe something, can change over time. For sure, things change over time. Change is pretty much the only constant. So super mindful about making things present, focused, and based is another way to prevent some of the pitfalls of over analyzing the hell out of whatever past experience you had, or trying to prevent whatever imaginary future you have from happening. So that would be, it's kind of obvious, but it's very useful for those of you who are already journaling actively to try and integrate this notion of present. And if you're already there, then increase tangibility with measurability, with quantifying things. Don't expect yourself to work out more. Test a specific frequency that you want to do, you know? Otherwise, you just get stuck with that sense that it's never good enough. So break it down into actual measurable chunks. Quality time with the family. Yeah.
It's like it comes back to the check-in with oneself that we talked about earlier with the regularity. So it's sort of you would probably want to be present regularly, sort of in a way that kind of joins the whole mindfulness movement of taking time in the present occasionally, in the whole rush of time traveling to the future potentials and the past oopses. So it's kind of like an invitation also to be present in the wider sense of it, not just present for talking to oneself, but in a way being contemplative. And I just was looking as you were talking, Jonas, at the definition in the Wikipedia definition of self-reflection. It says it's the ability to witness and evaluate our own cognitive, emotional, and behavioral processes. So, but the word witness and evaluate, and witnessing is sort of today quite linked to the whole idea of self-witnessing, and obviously mindfulness is very much that. So, interesting link to being present. If you've never heard of presencing, those of you who are still listening to us, it's something that I really encourage you to check out. Google Presencing Institute. It's connected to the MIT setup around leadership behavioral research, and you'll find Otto Scharmer's work there very interesting around the presencing. The idea of presencing with a human is to really hold space for them without judgment or trying to fix their problems, in a sense, if we really simplify it. Of course, it's way more than that. But then in a self presencing, that's the same thing. It's like looking at yourself in the present without judging yourself as good or bad, without necessarily trying to fix your own problems and trying to go into that, like, I need to find a fix mode, and just holding space for yourself and seeing what turns up.
Yeah.
So self-presencing. How does that? How do people cope with that in therapy? When you get people coming in and you sort of you sort of hint and you take them towards that direction, or even suggest being present. How do you suggest them to do it? Do they really struggle with that, or?
There's some common defenses like barriers or expected. One of those being I don't have time. The other one being I don't know how. A lot of people seem to think that journaling is just recording the events of their day. They think of the, teenage journal, like, oh, my crush talked to me today and I felt so excited, kind of a journal. And you also have this idea that other people are going to resent the fact that they take time for themselves or alone, or that that's going to be seen as something bad, or the sign that there's something wrong with the relationship. Or if I tell my partner that I'm going to have to, go and journal by myself once a week, they're going to think that I'm cheating, or something. So there's really something to be said about the meaning that's given to alone time, and also the prioritization that you're willing to give yourself. How full is your agenda, your like weekly planner, with other people's, like, where the focus of that meeting is some way for you to give time, value, energy, money to someone else in exchange for something. How much of your time is measurably devoted to yourself per week? So those are some of the main resistances that you would have from that. So that the idea of flow is super central. You can make any activity a little bit more rewarding and fun, and you can integrate notions like habit building to make this whole experience less of a chore and more of something that actually feels rewarding over time, but rewarding like exercise would be. You're not going to join the gym, have a six-pack in 3 weeks, and enjoy working out when you've been a couch potato your whole life. Not going to happen. Like, realistically, really actively, if you're expecting this to be fun and rewarding immediately, get glucose syrup. That'll hit you with instant dopamine. But these type of practices, to put it in plain English, it's just not very sexy, and that's the unfortunate reality of it. You have to find a way to make it work for you. You have to find a way to make it more rewarding. Do it in a way, combine it with some stuff that you love. I had a patient who would go and have cake with her inner parent on Sundays. So she would literally imagine that she's going with her mum to have cake, and she would use that opportunity to get herself a nice piece of guilt-free cake with the stamp of your therapist approval on it, and do some journaling in that moment. You have
exactly.
people that just do that by treating themselves to a run, and they have a double excuse. It's now it's healthy for my mind and for my body. So no one can hold it against me that I'm taking an hour going every weekend. So finding ways
or something. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Bear in mind is you have to have that being alone element. If we just take a little step into a spirituality and religion for a second, a lot of big religions have this notion of a long period of introspection. Very often it's 40 days in the desert, 40 days in a cave, like 40 days in a cave. I know this was the case for a lot of the prophets. This is true in Islam. It's true in the Christian faith and the Jewish faith. I remember correctly, I think you have very similar notions, I think, in the story in the life of Buddha. I'm not as familiar with his, biography, so I wouldn't want to say anything stupid. So you'd have to, but it is a very, very thing that comes back often, is this notion of a long period of time where you're digesting your experience, and that's when you get the revelation. So in a religious setting, obviously that relation comes from not you, but you have to be in the condition to receive it. Even if you're operating with a belief system and faith and reasoning beyond purely the rational, there is still something to be said about alone time. Prayer. How you're not going to pray in the middle of a busy meeting, or maybe if it's going terribly wrong.
Some people might in some corporations.
Please make this
But
go as quickly
the
as
metaphor.
possible.
Sorry, I'm going into French mode because we sometimes switch to French. And by the way, those of you watching, if you've noticed the difference between the northern style and the southern style, it's mostly down to how interruptions happen. Because in the south, we consider interruptions to be a sign of enthusiasm, not as a sign of disrespect. So I'll interrupt you, Jonas, now from now on freely, so that we go into this more dialogically. And the metaphor of decantering in the lake. You're sitting in the water and it's muddy. You can't move the water into clarity. You have to just wait for the mud to settle without any movement for a certain period of time. And there's a value in that metaphor applying into internal work, taking time for oneself, nurturing oneself. Sometimes is really just an act of patience. And I remember I was about to show the diagram on flow, but I think those of you who are watching this if you're from any gaming companies, for example, there's going to be a very inbuilt notion of what is the flow in its simple sense from Mihali's positive psychology, balancing level of competence and challenge with a high degree of motivation as a starting point. That you can apply to self-reflection. But then comes the big question of boredom, which is when you're not in the flow, when you're sort of in the comfort zone too long, just before you get to apathy. That boredom. I once met a therapist who talked about the value of boredom, gave me a whole book about it, made me read it. It was a terribly boring book. and the book itself was boring to read, and it was about boring as a concept throughout history. So you were looking at all the times in history where people were labeling boring with its whole semantic meaning. It was relatively boring text to read. But the whole thing's message, what I remember, was that it's in that moment of boredom that you finally give yourself usually permission to look within without taking life too seriously, without being too worried about things outside. And that's a healthy practice for today's day and age where everything is so stressful. Whereas the time when these monks were really bored, it was a boring lifestyle and a pace of life. So boredom might be sometimes a good antidote to stress.
Yeah.
What's the next one?
So the next one relates to this notion of honesty and firmly, like firmness, I would say. If you're going to be talking to yourself, might as well, swallow the hard pill that is the truth pill, and look at yourself realistically in the mirror, because you're not doing yourself a favor by trapping yourself in a position where, for example, you are a victim and you have zero control over a situation. If you're just having a journal of listing all the people that have harmed you and why your life is miserable because of them, that's more like setting you up on the path postal and become a serial killer than, become zen and spiritually awake and or at least just at peace with your life enough that you're not experiencing a mental health issue. Let's be realistic, not everyone has to achieve enlightenment. But yeah, there's this notion of honesty, and that notion of honesty also ties into this question of the feedback loop. When you're listening to yourself, observing yourself, what are you listening to, what are you listening for, and what are you observing? I'm talking about thoughts, emotions, intuition, monitoring behavioral patterns. As you know, as someone trained in economics and human-centered design, what people do is often more reliable than what they say. If you want to really know about someone, what they're doing, and look at how they're living their lives, don't necessarily ask them about themselves. It's interesting to do both and to contrast that, but you're going to want to apply some of that listening to yourself. And the idea is you can look at different parameters, different instruments. You can try and make this measurable to some extent. So don't just listen to your thoughts about a topic. You might want to monitor like your physical sensations in that situation. Let's say you're journaling to solve a particular issue. You've identified a specific trigger. You understand where it comes from because when you were 7 years old, this specific thing happened and blah, blah, blah. Well, there's still probably some benefits to really monitor this in different ways, to look at yourself through different lenses. So yeah, how does my body react to this? There's such a thing as misattribution of arousal, which is when you basically have a bodily sensation and you confuse it with something else. The study I remember that they did this on was they were doing a study on human attractiveness and how humans rate each other as attractive and rate themselves as attractive. They were trying to understand some of the principles of like what makes that we are into certain people. And what they did is they got two strangers to cross each other on a bridge that was high enough and swinging enough that it was likely to bring along some physiological response that would be a little bit just enough to get you, a little bit alive. And they noticed that the people that were in that experimental setting tended to rate each other as more attractive because they were attributing some of that arousal to the attractiveness of the other person because of the condition of the setting as well and the experiment and the fact there were being questions about that, no doubt. So it is interesting to look at how you're physically responding to a situation. To give you a concrete clinical example of this, so this is a bit of this is the clinical reality. So I'm just going to say it as it is, like medically. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. So this was a young man that was having panic attacks when he was about to be intimate with his partner. And he was looking for where this was coming from. And the experience, when we actually looked at this and we were looking at it specifically for this physiological angle, we realized that because of panic attacks he'd been having related to another issue, his mind had basically overgeneralized any physiological response that was similar to this with panic, and therefore just fit sexual arousal in that moment for him. But already just being aware of that meant that he had another explanation for it, and he was able to just take a little step back to the point where it wouldn't interrupt the overall process. Let's say in the beginning, it still took some time for him to be able to get to the point where it just, barely comes into his, mind. But still, like, it's an example of how paying attention to your physiological self is as important as paying attention to your mental self. And just the finishing point on this would be having activities that give you that feedback loop. Gardening gives you a very interesting feedback loop about yourself. Your plants don't lie to you. And if you know people with different gardens,
is that why mine die then? Oh dear, what is that saying about me?
it could be overcaring, it could be undercaring, it could be not knowing them enough. But in any case, it says something about you. It tells you something about yourself if you're willing to put in the energy to figure it out. And if you know people with different gardens, you'll know that their garden says something about their personality. So look at your physical space, about you, your behaviors, what you're reading every day, what you're listening to every day, what you're eating every day. Those are important things to monitor as well. Or a final example on this would be sports. For example, climbing. if you're trying to understand, okay, what is my relationship to risk? And you just sit down and you have that conversation with yourself, and you're just persuading yourself that you're brave. No, you take risks. You're not a coward. There's no way you're a coward. But then you take that question out onto a climbing wall in a bouldering situation or on a cliff, and then you compare yourself to other people. Then you look at how you're approaching it and how you're progressing on this question, and that gives a more reliable feedback loop. And you notice, oh, okay, my starting fear was lower than most beginners, but I plateaued very quickly because I'm scared of this specific type of move. Or you'll notice that, like, to overcome my fear, I can use these principles that I learned here, for example, deliberately taking a fall, to challenge your fear in other areas. So a concrete example with that would be, I work with a lot of often guys that struggle with fear of interacting with, women that they find attractive. And there is often this idea of look for situations where you're failing. Don't try and get anything out of it. Practice just talking for talking's sake. Remove the whole, I'm going to get from this. You go for the failure to get comfortable with your worst case scenario happening, and you get desensitized to it. So that's just one way. You can use climbing to become self-aware. You can use gardening to be self-aware. You can take a walk around your house and look at it like an anthropologist and stuff about yourself. Or you can ask other people. Yeah.
Do you remember this, that we drew up a few years ago when we were doing these like one-on-one coachings with Mondada drawings? Like, I think I still got a few left. Like, it was this, we had these beautiful pictures that were hand drawn to color in and reflect with the 4 levels of honesty. And I thought I'd share it here because it's kind of very segue into what you said, Jonas. Like, did you remember that there was like, and I kind of used this to journal as well. I was thinking, how does the journaling, I'm going to put you in on the corner a second here so that we can see better. The honesty to others about others. That's like gossip, Oh, have you heard what Lisa did? Oh, and then it's like you're being honest about Lisa to somebody else about somebody else. It's generally not very good at creating social trust between people because it creates these sort of mixed messages and a lot of drama. So the level 1 of honesty is sort of, it's okay, but I think we should aim for level 2 at least. And that's honesty to myself about others. So it's like, do I really like that person? Do I really think that of them? Or is that just the motorway of thinking? And am I doing this because I think that that's the right thing to think? So there's like honesty to myself about other people, like kind of meta-reflecting on the gossip. So it's one level down in metacognition. Then there's the level of honesty to others about myself. That's where people often struggle with vulnerability, to others about self. So it's like being able to say, yeah, I messed up. Yeah, it doesn't make me a bad person, but I did mess up and I'm sorry. That level of honesty, that's sort of very, very great for building trust via vulnerability in leadership, for example. It's very much a necessary thing these days when people, rather than trying to sort of find excuses, like the idea of extreme ownership from the Navy SEALs, Jocko Willink is talking about this nicely. It requires that level 3 honesty. And then there's the level 4, which is really difficult, which I think is where you were touching upon, Jonas, is honesty to self about self, which is really like the ultimate, the holy grail of self-honesty, is being able to be objectively honest about yourself. And what, Jonas, you're describing, for example, with climbing is a great mirror to that honesty to self about self.
And this is where I'm going to have to jump in and bring the limit to the talking to self, which is, again, sometimes to be honest to yourself about yourself, you need an outside person for accountability and for coherence. And this is where it can be therapy. It can take on different forms. It can just be leaning on your support group. As just a little word about therapy, there's this idea, maybe nowadays it's more and more present, that everyone should do therapy or that everyone needs a psychologist. But I really want to emphasize that's not necessarily the case. And I also want to emphasize that you don't necessarily need to have a big problem or a mental health issue to want to see a therapist, just like you don't want to wait for cancer to go and see your general practitioner, your family doctor, But that being said, there is a limit to how much honesty you can have in that self-to-self talk. And that's where you need other people to ask you the annoying questions that make you, shake your fist at them and be like, oh, I hate that question. Why did you ask it to me? But you're right. And
like in Suits.
So Yeah.
Like in Suits, when he goes to his therapist and he gets really angry with his therapist because he doesn't want to hear what he knows he should hear in a parent-child in conflict, but not assumed, and very much yeah. So it becomes. Thank you for adding that in. I'll just point us to the number 5, because I think you had another one here for us up your sleeve. This was the levels of honesty. This was about self-honesty. But what's number 5?
Yeah, this one is the curveball. It's the not too much. At some point, you cannot talk to yourself too much. You cannot spend too much time thinking about stuff. Like there is a moment where thought is a great, slave, a terrible master, even though that's a very dodgy way to put it. But it's a quote from somewhere. To be honest, I don't remember who. I seem to remember it's a Greek philosopher, but I don't remember which one.
Let's go to
So
Quotepedia. Yes.
yeah, but anyway, there is this idea that thought is best used as a basis for action. Uh, you won't think your problems away. You won't think yourself to a better person. We're the products of our actions and our environments. And there is a moment where, if you're journaling, especially for growing as a professional, or for shaping and crafting a specific aspect of yourself, your personality, even if you're just an athlete and you just want to get better, results, you benefit from having action-based, goal-orientated behavior. Like you need to have that reflection, that strategy directed at something concrete in the outside world. That'll then translate into a healthier self-esteem, more control, feeling of control over your life, and just probably it is at the end of the day just a game of probability. There is no certainty. You can never smoke a day in your life and get lung cancer. Life isn't fair. Like realistically, I think most people that have thought a tiny bit about life will reach that conclusion quite readily. Most people still get pissed about that fact that life isn't fair, but I mean, getting angry literally doesn't change. Life doesn't care how angry you are about it not being fair. I'm pretty sure, speaking on behalf of megalomaniac here, sorry. But yeah, that being said, there has to be a limit to that conversation. Just like you wouldn't want to be talking to your best friend constantly. I mean, maybe some people have that very symbiotic relationship with their besties. I mean, whatever works for you. I love my friends. I really genuinely don't want to be talking to them 24/7. And that goes to say something about relationships in general. Every relationship needs space. Needing time apart in a relationship shouldn't only happen once there's a problem, or it's not the sign necessarily that there is a problem. To have a healthy relationship, you need to deliberately cultivate what you share, when you share it, and also what you don't share and when you don't share it. And those are super important dimensions. You could also phrase it in a slightly different way and say, if talking and being mindful, connecting to something, there comes a time where you can't always be connected to you can't always be connected to the other people, you can't always be connected to the virtual reality. Sometimes you need to disconnect in whatever way is realistic and healthy. Obviously, some people disconnect in very healthy ways, some people disconnect in slightly less healthy ways, and I mean, sometimes that's okay. The idea is not to be perfect, right? That's not realistic, but there has to be a time where you can also connect to something a bit beyond all of this. Is where maybe the conversation moves beyond the self-help, more into something related to spiritual questions, because it touches on concepts such as nirvana, enlightenment, and all of that, which is the ability to connect yourself into something bigger to yourself, bigger than yourself, where in a way you diffuse that. It's not about you anymore. It's not about a circus is going on around you. It's a part of, and fundamentally managing to accept the ride that you're on, even if you don't like all the aspects of that ride. But I think that's just something to keep in the back of our minds, as a general principle on this topic. But this is a little bit meta and a little bit more touching on spiritual side of the
These are
equation.
super powerful questions that are coming out, and reflections as well. I think it's important to be able to have the space to talk about these topics, because it's almost like right now when you look at the conversations online, I'll often get friends who call and who said like they don't have the meta level of thinking in conversations, in daily conversations very often, because people are busy just giving each other instructions, orders, and updates. and there's an
Yeah.
overflow of those. But the spaciousness that we can take here in the conversation, in a way, can be also made from yourself, which is if you look at it from the ego perspective, it's a way of being able to detach from your own self. In other words, detach from your identity of self, your ego. So being able to disconnect and have space away from yourself, like I need a holiday from me kind of thing,
Oh,
is
I've heard
not a
that before. I hear
shortcoming.
that every week.
Yeah. So it's not a shortcoming needing a holiday from oneself. It's not that I'm giving up or that I don't value myself and I'm not being a responsible human, but sometimes it's healthy to be able to step away from one's personal dramas, identities, and narratives to be able to see the wood for the trees and see what's really going on. And I think for me, that's manifested, for example, as where humor appears. When I understood the link between humor and ego, I really started to get interested in stand-up comedy and saw the difference between sustainable stand-up, the sort of so-called woke stand-up, and then the mainstream stand-up, and then there's many different layers of stand-up comedy. But one thing that's really interesting in the idea of comedy is that if you can laugh at yourself in a really healthy and honest way, self-honest way,
Mm.
without it being an ironic defense mechanism to hide behind, that's a sign that you're free from your own ego triggers and your sort of own demons as such. It's a great strategy to be able to help yourself grow apart sometimes and just look at it and have a laugh at yourself and go, it is a bit ridiculous. So to me, the humor is a fantastic example of doing what you say, making space for yourself, help seeing other people make space for themselves by humor. Not all comedians do that, but there are some who really are masterful at making you step back and think, I'm not who I am, who I think I am. Maybe there's another side to this all. What's your favorite comedian at the
Oh,
moment?
that's a difficult one.
If you
Oh,
were to
I
toast
like a
a
few.
stand-up right now, who would it be?
Uh, I think it would be Dave Chappelle.
Dave Chappelle.
Because he has, yeah, because he just has a way of being very, very authentic and real. And obviously that's very triggering for a lot of people, and I can understand that.
Hmm.
But there is a level of unwillingness to compromise, fairness at the time. Like I think time you've seen him like really interact over time, like when you've looked at his career, you look at his public appearances, you look at the data set of how he actually behaves and how he treats the people around him.
Hmm.
I find him to be a really inspiring person and a brilliant comedian. Um, I mean, yeah, he's one of the ones that I really like. Um, I I'm impressed with my cat right now, who's giving me attitude because I'm not giving him the attention that he wants. So a practical example in parenting is placing boundaries on our little furry friends. Say goodbye to the internet and go and do your thing over there. There we go. So yeah, but yeah, there are
Sweet.
many other really great ones. I mean, yeah, I'm just going to stick to that because otherwise I'd have to start listing all of them, and no one wants to hear that.
Dave Chappelle. Yeah, no, I was just looking him up just to have a face. I think I know him. Yes, I know Dave Chappelle, of course. Yes. Yeah, mine is Key and Peele at the moment because of how they did the whole um, Luther, the President Obama's anger translate. It's one of my favorite YouTube videos to show that ego distance. I use it all the time. It's already 2015. It's pretty old, but I like
Yeah,
their style of being provocative, but still asking powerful questions in their stand up. It's not just like gratuitous. There's a really clear positive and not dystopian underlying invitation for thinking, which is interesting as well. What's your final wrap up for this? Like, if I synthesize what we've done, we've got quite a lot of things. We went through, you know, what's the psychological safety. Then we talked about the regular check-ins, like drumbeat over time, self-parent, parent-child, being fair with that dynamic,
yeah,
whatever it is, even if it's a Karpman triangle of victim, savior, aggressor, or it's a parent, child, adult. It's like being fair, and then the present with presencing self, being holding space for oneself, and mindfulness really. Self-honesty with the levels of honesty, with the hardest being the fourth, honesty to self about self, not just about others or to others. And then
mm,
the fifth was making space for yourself, but not too much of it. So in other words, finding that dynamic balance where you don't just go too much in the mind and journal everything and overanalyze everything, but then remember that actually the world is full of the action also, and to be part of stepping away from your own ego and being able to just be rather than just do. So that's kind of where we went. We went quite around the world on these topics, and we could probably, I'm sure, go another 2 hours, particularly if
Oh
we had
yeah.
a bigger flip chart, right? So what are your, like, if we were to round up, we like to do these Viking check-ins. And so one of the rounds in the Viking check-in is the toast. Okay. So what would be a toast of a tool, a person, a book, something that people can look up, right? Something that you can share that people can right now Google and find something with it. What would be one toast to do with today's topic, which obviously is healthy ways to talk with yourself? And we can both do
Uh,
it so that we have like
yeah.
I can inspire myself from yours.
Or, well, actually, genuinely, the first thing that came to my mind was actually you, because I think with the type of work that you're doing, actually, structuring, mapping these things out, being this cartographer, ethnographer of, relationships and communication, and putting so much time and energy into trying to create usable, easy tools to make some sense of, this complex reality. I think it's super important, like actively people need this type of stuff. And when I use concepts that you've developed in therapy or that we've co-created, it is very impactful and very empowering. So I would definitely toast you. But if I had to toast someone that's not you, I think I would just toast. I think philosophers in general. Why philosophers specifically on this question? Because in a way they've been mapping and templating human experience for thousands of years. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are some great concepts out there. This is something that I find is a personal tragedy of the French school system, is that we're not taught how to put philosophy in its place in the toolkit of knowledge and existence. It's supposed to just give us critical thinking by studying philosophy, and you'll kind of figure it out, read enough books, and you'll make sense of it. But I really directly see that when people find a good philosophical stance, like develop a personal philosophy, if you will, based on bits and pieces from other ones, it helps them as a guide for life. And I think that that's where it's super important to give credit to all the wonderful thinkers that we've had in the past. Like I was reading something by Seneca, Consolations. I was reading Mark Aurelius's, journaling, like reflection points, and it's wonderful to see like how contemporary those things are. A man mapping out in their thoughts is universal and timeless, and there's something really beautiful and practical about this philosophy in that way. About trying to find a holy truth, just use it as points of reference to shape your thinking, to notice certain things about your thinking, and combine that with tools like the tools that Esteve is developing for Green Elephant, and working together with Anu, and all the other people that we worked with over the years. But using tools that with the kind of backbone of philosophy to guide the thinking there is I think a great bulletproof recipe, to the extent that there is a bulletproof recipe to these questions. So that would be my toast.
Wow. I'll toast to that. Thank you. I don't have any more water. Oh, I do have a bit more water here. Yeah, thank you. I'll toast to the Ikigai concept. A couple of weeks ago, I redrew it as a vector. I'll put it behind here. But the Ikigai concept is nothing new. It's this idea of finding your sort of bullseye focus in life, which basically generates a lot of motivation and energy. I think a lot of people know it already, and it's universal. It's not Japanese, but the Japanese have a beautiful word for it, very simplified. The overlap of what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for is a space of reflection that opens up with when you go pragmatically into yourself. And like, I'm toasting this concept because I've had many moments when I felt like I don't know what to do next. If I'm being honest with myself, I'm a bit like clueless as to what's my next life path, mission, or focus on the next challenge. Kind of, how do I sort of make decisions on some big life decisions? Often I come back to this and I think, really, don't just focus on what you love. or don't just focus on what you can be paid for if you're worried about money. But, you know, focus on those four, because they're going to generate automatic a lot of energy. That's what I've experienced myself. So when I think of a toast, I would toast the actual philosophy. I don't know if it's philosophy or the concept, mental model of the ikigai as a great tool for self-reflection, particularly for the younger millennials who are right now making big life choices and wondering around a lot about what to do and how to make meaningful impact in the world. So,
Nice.
Jonas, thank you. Do we have any promotion of anything on your musical side here, or anything on your work side, or do I then just do my close with what we're finally launching in the shop next week?
I
Do you
maybe
have
had
any?
like just a last point, just that I didn't have time to touch on in terms of the toxic self-talk,
Sure.
just in terms of preparing for the darkness of winter and some signs that you might want to look out for, some further red flags. I think obviously anything related to starting to consider suicide as an option, and to start to trick yourself
Mm,
into thinking that death is actually a relief. If you think about it just very practically, we have no idea. Maybe what awaits you after death is actually much, much worse than what we have right now. So it's not even a guarantee that it would end your suffering. But all jokes aside, it's not worth panicking if a suicidal thought has crossed your mind. Most people have at some point at least entertained the option from the moment that you know it exists, right? It's a fascinating and terrible question. But from the moment that you catch yourself regularly starting to construe this as a solution, that's when it's really super important to reach out, to I would say anyone at that stage, but especially people who are trained to handle it, because your friends, your loved ones might not know how to react, and that might be a barrier to sharing it. But this is exactly why there are hotlines. This is exactly why anonymous ways to book appointments for yourself. Um, never keep those thoughts to yourself. That it doesn't typically end in a happy place, and it's not worth carrying that burden by yourself. If you feel powerless, if you feel like you're not having
mm.
control over your life anymore, that can happen. Life gets too much for us sometimes. It doesn't mean that it's going to stay like that forever. It doesn't mean that it's actually not manageable in practice. But yeah, that's one major red flag out for that I didn't really have time to go into. Um, and in terms of things coming out or projects, or I mean, if anyone wants to, have a session with me, they can always go to my website, jonaspannetier.com. You can self-book time in my calendar there if you want to have a chat. And if you have any questions or anything interesting that you would like to share or anything, please reach out on social media. Obviously, LinkedIn being the one that I probably use the most, or just directly through my website, just shoot me an email. But yeah, apart from that, nothing really to put forward as up and coming. But yeah,
I
that's
was
the
teasing
just
you
the
with the idea of your SoundCloud, which is another project. But I
no
think
no
one of the
no
great things about Jonas is his whole ability to create art with this whole topic of metacognition. So, but that will be later. We'll do another session on that topic of
yeah.
musical exchange and everything. Thank you, Jonas. Thank you very much. I'll be putting a replay of this video. Please remember to subscribe and, the usual like and thing to show us that what we're doing is actually useful. If not, then don't. But then at least we'll know, thank you, that it was deliberate and conscious. And what we'll do is share with you just one thing here that is sort of correlated to what Jonas said. In the next couple of days, I'm going to be launching a sort of self do it yourself kind of scan, what we call a scan, or it's an assessment of your inner world. And some of you have already done this as a group thing in a company as part of a workshop, but now we're launching it as a thing that you can do yourself. And I'm really excited actually, because we're going to be doing a dashboard. I'm redesigning it right now, making it more clear with our iconography here. But basically, it could be a really good tool to think about where you have internal conflicts. Because at the moment, there's a lot of these. I don't know how to identify, for example, my communication needs, and how that creates potential friction with people at work, particularly with hybrid work. These kind of things are being measured in this. And what we do with the data analysis afterwards is just send you back a dashboard where you can basically do a reflection with a bit of a booster. So it's like based on your own reality. And what Jonas is describing with these powerful questions, it basically asks you a lot of powerful questions on a category. So I'll be putting a video out on this when I do some advertising on it. But just wanted to share with you now that it's going to be launched pretty soon. And I think it goes well with the topic of today, self-reflection, and being very responsible for one's own internal realities or disrealities. So thank you, Jonas. And may you all have a great 2 weeks. We're going to take a 1 week break while we prepare the next streaming. And then after that break, I will be actually having a dialogue with Professor Rosie from Vassar University. He's a professor of communication. And we're going to be having a sort of more reflective and future-oriented conversation / dialogue, even maybe co-creative conversation about big questions, self-reflection questions, but from a perspective of science and metacognition, and like what is really going on in our heads, and looking at it from a social perspective rather than an inner perspective like we did today, but look into the world. So great conversation probably come out. I have no idea what's going to come out, but I'll be hosting it quite like today with a doodle board and joining if you want to ask questions, and it's going to be fantastic fun. Thank you, Jonas.
Thank
See
you.
you in 2 weeks.